Hello and welcome back to ESPN Scrum Reset for another edition. Sam Bruce welcoming in Christy Doran after the completion of the Rugby Championship for 2022, won by New Zealand, I guess quite easily in the end, given the job they did on the Wallabies on Saturday night. Christy, 40-14, which was another deflating night for Australian rugby at Eden Park.
Is anyone surprised, Sam?
I certainly wasn't.
It just had one of those feelings, didn't it? And you see the first 2 minutes, and it kind of brought me back. And we were there in 2019, I think, at Eden Park, and Christian Lealiifano kicks out in the full. And on this occasion, you see a Jed Holloway break, and you go, okay, that's interesting. But then within a matter of moments, the big Wallabies and Waratahs lock is sent to the sin bin, and it just had that feeling that they were hanging on. Nothing went right for them. They, the percentage plays weren't there all night, I didn't think. And look, I don't think it helped the loss of Lalakai Foketi early on, and I don't think we can understate that, because I thought the attack was just really shoddy after that. And, it shouldn't surprise anyone, given that Len Ikitau, a guy that's hardly ever played at inside centre, jumps across, and Geordie Bataille, who's not really played any matches at outside centre in recent weeks or months, slots into 13. It just didn't gel at all, the 12-13 partnership. And we're going to go on and dissect that more and more. But that opening 10 minutes, you can't afford those sorts of minor but big errors in Bledisloe matches, particularly at Eden Park.
No, you're right. And it was an incredible start, because Jed goes through, I think, on about 35, 40 seconds. And you think, well, here we go. A bit of field position early, the chance to really apply some pressure. And then he and Harry Wilson get that clean out wrong. And, we won't go too much into it, but the word consistency comes up in terms of the Tyrell Lomax clean out, very similar the week before in Melbourne. But it was just, for them to actually start well, or have a chance of ending this 36-year drought at Eden Park, they really had to start well. And a yellow card inside 90 seconds, it probably doesn't get much worse. Of course, that gave the All Blacks, the chance to get up the other end and apply some pressure themselves. And while the Wallabies did well to just hang on through a couple of pushover scrum attempts from 5 metres out and then a line out, we knew that pressure and that fatigue, I guess, was going to come into the game a little bit later on. And you mentioned the Foketi injury, and the All Blacks working a nice move, which had a lot of Joe Schmidt about it, I thought, with Will Jordan just hanging on the edge and skipping around the outside of Jordan Petaia to score. And it was always going to be downhill from then. Obviously compounded by Dave Parecki's sin binning for pulling down the maul and the penalty try. The double whammy that is those circumstances, as it was with Dalton Papali'i in Melbourne a week earlier. So yeah, it was a terrible first half, really. And we hark back, and Dave Rennie, you and I were both on the post-match presser around discipline. And I'm just running the numbers this morning. The Wallabies finished up as the second most penalised team, with 85 conceded penalties across the tournament. But that was only because the Pumas finished with 22 and 18 the week before against South Africa. So while they were number 2, I think, across the whole, and they were the only team to be penalised 16 times or more, 3 times during the tournament. So some numbers there that reflect the discipline woes. And also they were the most yellow carded team of the tournament with 8, with Springboks and the Pumas on 7. So, I mean, that's got to be top of the list, doesn't it? This discipline problem. It's been around a while now, and seemingly not getting any better.
Yeah, and I finished off my column yesterday afternoon by using the word accountability, and people and players needing to look in the mirror and go, is what they're dishing up, serving up, is that good enough? And things like discipline, things like not deciding to play on quickly from a penalty, they're things you can control. I think a lot of the time, the discipline stuff, we it's dropping at the knees and the hips, isn't it? And it's getting back on side. Look, I thought there was some really tough nitpicking kind of penalties there from Andrew Brace. I think of Pete Samuel, who gets the ball, and then falls over after that. He's clearly got the ball while standing up. and that's straight in front of Andrew Brayer. So that you can always find incidents there where you go, that probably shouldn't have been. But on the whole, it's not just a recurring pattern. It's a huge theme under Dave Rennie as being ill-disciplined, and it really was also under Michael Cheika at times too. It's probably the most simplistic way of keeping yourself in the fight, isn't it? And the scrum went backwards, and that was a really disappointing feature of the Test match, was that both James Slipper and Angus Bell struggled. Now, was that because of greasy conditions? Was that because it was Lomax there, I think, on the tight head side? Was that he did seem like he was a long way back and they were pinged for
one occasion
at times? Well, you never really know unless you can see both angles exactly what's going on there. But it's frustrating that a lot of the things that I saw on the weekend were controllable things. And in the first half an hour, they had lots of opportunities that they did really well to survive that early onslaught when they were down to 14 men. But Harry Wilson dropping a ball that, if he's playing more, when he's played more Test match rugby recently, probably hangs on to that one. That could be a first game back situation sort of thing. But that's inside the opposition 22 after 13, 14 minutes. Clearly, you've got an incident there with Tom Wright playing gone. And for me, I can't understand that. Why there's two wingers sweeping back there. There's a lot of men around. No one knows that you're playing on quickly. And it's inside the first 30 minutes. You just back your rolling ball there, don't you, every day of the week. And then 3, Marika Koroibete, he gets that one wrong by just having his foot on the touchline the whole time. They're basic things. And, if you go into halftime at 17-5 or 17-7, you never know. It's a 2-score game. But the moment he put his foot out into the touchline, it just seemed ominous. And clearly the Sam Whitelock try just meant that there was no chance that the Wallabies were coming back. If Dave Rennie can take anything from that, it's the fact that they didn't actually stop fighting. They scored 2 tries there at the end. Midway through the second half, clearly with some good work, good pressure from Nick Frost, great work from Pete Salmon to keep the ball alive, and probably even better hands from Folau Flying and hang on to it. But the final try from Geordie Petaia, it gives a little bit of gravy, does nothing to really ease the loss. But guys like Geordie Petaia in particular have to look at themselves and go, is what they're doing good enough?
He's a player that seems to, I don't know if he's down on confidence slightly. There was, he spilled a very simple pass again at one stage, and the hands have always been a problem for Geordie since his ascension to this Wallabies team at the 2019 World Cup. The Tom Wright one, I want to go back to that, and foolishly, I didn't think of the question at the time, but it would have been a valid one to ask Dave Rennie on Saturday night. Has he been given the license to take a quick tap in that situation, or is that purely just a brain explosion from a player who is very, I don't want to say scatty's the wrong word, but certainly plays with a lot of energy, wants to keep the game moving, play quickly, because that from what is a junior player in this side, to take a quick tap in that scenario when, as you say, the play is very much to kick into within 10 metres of the line, kick to the corner, set up your rolling maul, which the Wallabies have a strong one, as we've seen that in the past, and even the ability to score when it gets stopped, as we saw in Melbourne. It's an unfathomable decision at that point in the game, let alone at any point in the game, from a player that is, just in his infancy within this squad. So I do wonder whether Dave, or perhaps Wisey, has said to him at some point, just get in there and just take a sneaky quick tap and catch them unawares, because otherwise it's a complete and utter brain explosion, isn't it?
It's a really good question. And that's probably one of the issues when you've only got a few minutes when you're speaking to Dave post-game. But you're right. That is a bizarre decision, what he took place. And I think we've seen examples of that right throughout this rugby championship, and even actually to England, where Tom Wright in Brisbane was exceptional against the English, but it could have unravelled really badly there, because there was a number of instances where he decided to play on quickly, or rather than put boot to ball, which most fullbacks would do, decided to back himself. And look, he won a bit of praise by doing so. Like Dave Dave Campese is a bit admirer of him for doing just that, taking the game on. But regardless, I don't think that Dave Rennie's telling a player like Tom Wright to when you're already down, when you're already struggling a little bit, when you've only just got back to 15 men, when you've had a yellow card only 10 minutes earlier. I don't think the play there at any circumstances to play on quickly.
What about Christy? We probably can park Saturday night there. I think, as you mentioned, we covered the game. There were a couple of late Wallabies tries at least. Sorry, one more point.
Well, Sam, before we move on, is there, and one Wallaby messaged me this, who there left with their socks up? And I think the only two players really that can say that they did were Pete Samu and Rob Valentini. I can't see anyone. Harry Wilson gave it a good crack, but I can't see anyone there right across the board who's left with their stocks up. Even Andrew Kellaway, there's a spilt ball there. He did some good things, I think, but as did Bernard Foley. But the defence was a real issue. I think Jake Gordon probably defensively had a really good crack for the first 45, 48 minutes, but then gets subbed off. There are not many leave Eden Park there with their stocks up.
No, you and I spoke about this yesterday when we were preparing for this pod, and I agree. I found it very hard to give anyone other than Pete Samu a 6, and probably Valentini. Well, it was one of his quieter games. I think he was still, second best behind Samu in that regard. And when you look at Valentini's body of work throughout both the England series and the Rugby Championship, then he's probably very close to making a back row of the tournament, you would have to say, although the young Argentine at number 6 and Ardie Savea at number 8, perhaps there's some way in there that you fit him. He's certainly in a 23, if not starting. But Pete Samu, I guess that's one of the big positives from this tournament. Through Michael Hooper's withdrawal, we've learned a little bit more about Pete Samu. So often, or for so long, pigeonholed as an impact player off the bench who perhaps suits these looser style of games because he does like to hang out wide and in the tram tracks, but he's actually proven that he can play tighter. We think of that break in Melbourne last week when he went up the middle of the field. He stepped in and threw the line out on the weekend and worked a play at the front that almost resulted in a try. I think that was in the lead up to the Corambetti foot in touch. So there's a silver lining from the last few weeks, you would have to say. But you're right, it was the other Wallabies in the 23 on Saturday night. It was very hard to give any of them a pass mark, and it was a really, really disappointing end. Not that we've come to expect anything else from trips to Eden Park, and that one that you and I were at a few years ago, when you've seen something like that and you've seen how the ground is and how the crowd are, it's a black wave. Visiting teams are encircled by that. You've got to think whether Australia will ever win there again. But yeah, it's the Rugby Championship on the whole, it finishes. They finished third with 2 wins and 4 defeats. You think of the blowout loss in Argentina. The fairly listless display next door here where I am today at the Fox Studios offices here at the new Allianz on what was meant to be a historic and motivating night. And then the weekend, with the only outlier being that dramatic loss in Melbourne. How do you rate it overall? It's clearly not a pass mark. Is it a 4 out of 10? Is it a 3 out of 10? And when you reflect further back into the England series, lost 2-1 and dropping the last 3 matches on the spring tour, there's a real kind of narrative emerging here around this Wallabies team that they just can't get the chocolates. And clearly, number one, as well as their ill discipline, is the fact that they can't string back-to-back games together, which Dave has only done. Sorry, this Wallabies team under Dave Rennie has only done on one occasion, and that was with those 5 straight wins through the back half of the Rugby Championship and then over Japan last year.
Yeah, and James Slipper touched upon that, didn't he, on Saturday evening, where he said, look, the confidence is still there, but we're not going to get anywhere in a World Cup if we can't string back-to-back texts together. So he's well and truly aware of it. He's cognizant of it. Dave Rennie's surely cognizant of it as well. I found his remark a little bit surprising regarding discipline, what can be done there. And he said selection, and kind of left it at that. Clearly, selection can sort out things at times, but you're the bloke who's supposed to be getting these selections right, aren't you? Look, where does the TRC rank? I think it's probably a 4. probably a C plus, maybe, given that, the adversity that they faced with Quade Cooper's injury, followed by, and preceded by Michael Hooper's withdrawal. Like
Samu Kerevi, yeah.
Samu Kerevi not playing a minute in it. I think you can't underestimate those sorts of things. They're three world-class players. They're three players that slot in there every day of the week at 7, 10, and at 12. And I think Kerevi was the biggest loss there. We saw Bernard Foley manage to put a couple of performances together. Likewise, Noah Lolosio, the confidence, the accuracy maybe not there always, particularly probably from the defensive point of view, but really tough ask to come in with no rugby on the back of 4 or 5 months there, basically. It's a really important spring tour coming up right now. Like, Dave Rennie's got the support of the board. He's got the support of the chairman. I made mention of Dan Herbert 4 years ago saying to me that we've got to get away from the coach being the issue and the immediate outrage and go, well, what are some of the other issues? Because is Ewan McKenzie a bad coach? Is Michael Checker a bad coach? Is Eddie Jones a bad coach? These guys have proven that they're not bad coaches. So what's going on here? I think injury is a big thing. There's been more and more questions around the strength and conditioning programs. My understanding is one's already gone from his own choosing, but Dean Benton is likely to depart and not have his contract renewed. We've clearly seen Matt Taylor pushed out the back door from a defensive point of view, Laurie Fisher coming in. There's been a lot of change. Now it's about stability, it's about building, and it's about building every week, and you go for the detail. And that's something that Laurie Fisher's very, very good at, is the detail, and he doesn't cut corners. So I like to think that the next 5 tests, and there's still a lot of test match rugby to be played this year, is going to be hugely important for setting some of the foundations, getting some of the players right, and more than anything for Dave Rennie, I think, working on his selection and making sure he gets that bang on.
Before we look ahead both to the Australia A tour, to Japan, and then the spring tour, as you mentioned, let's put a bow on the wider rugby championship, I guess. Won by New Zealand, obviously that big win, that 26-point win over the Wallabies, going a long way to secure that as they entered the weekend with, I think, about must have been then a 13-point start on the Springboks. They win the title despite all the talk this year and the home loss to Argentina, and it could have been a very different final round had we not had the drama in Melbourne last weekend, clearly. Are they a better team than South Africa at this point, looking ahead to the World Cup? Have they got their ducks in a row, so to speak, New Zealand, the All Blacks? I mentioned Joe Smith's impact on their attack. I think it really it's clearly not, where it could be just yet, because he's only been in the job a few games, but that Will Jordan try, it had a very kind of Irish look at that sweeping kind of multiple ball runners with the ability to play out the back or, at the line. Ian Foster, he's got the backing now. He's done his job. He's won, the Bledisloe and Rugby Championship, I guess, just as he did last year. And we saw what happened earlier this year. So I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the rankings today, but I would imagine South Africa is still ahead of them. Who's the better side there, do you think, right now?
Great question. Well, you consider that the All Blacks managed to win at Ellis Park there, so they've won 1 from 2 away. That's not a bad effort when you're going to the Republic to win a game there. On that logic, you can potentially say New Zealand. Clearly, they've won the Rugby Championship. But I would think if it's a World Cup semi-final right now, who would be more confident, or who would have that game plan that they go, no, this is how we're going to play. These are the players that we're going to play. I think South Africa are ahead from that perspective.
It could be a World Cup quarterfinal between those two next year.
Yeah, indeed. So there's a lot at stake here. I'm, from an Australian perspective, thrilled that the Wallabies aren't on a draw which features France, Ireland, New Zealand, and South Africa on that side. Good luck. But
World Rugby, I mean, of all the decisions they're making at the moment, or the lack of decisions on an activity on some points, surely this farcical policy set up where they have the World Cup draw, was it done, 2.5 years out or something this time around with the With the
It was
rankings the
done,
way they were?
at the end of 2020, it was done, I think.
3 years out before the tournament. How ridiculous. And you know, as a rugby fan, you want to see, you know, certainly the four best quarters and I think the four best teams, in the semifinals. But the reality is that the way the rankings are at the moment, and unless there is some significant improvement from those on the other side of the draw, that we're probably not going to get that.
You're right. You make a point, but let's not forget that nations at times have the habit of peaking outside of a World Cup year.
Hello, Ireland.
Hello, Ireland. Sorry to remind you, Catherine Murphy. But that's, we're going to see an English side coached by Eddie Jones, which will be formidable next year, I think. Clearly, the Wallabies that aren't there at the moment, they're number 9 in the rankings. That's unfathomable. When you think about, you know, the fact that Robbie Dean's managed to have the Wallabies at number 2 for so long, it goes to show that the man could coach, and that yes, he had a good side and he had the likes of Pocock and George Smith at times, a really fit, young, and adventurous team with the Bills and the Coopers and the O'Connors coming through the system. Maybe not the forward pack that is currently in existence, I think, but particularly the tight 5. But this Wallaby side has a lot to grow, and James Slipper spoke about that very point, the fact that so many have been blooded, and this isn't me trying to make excuses for this side, but I think that in a year's time, if Dave Rennie can get his selection right, the Wallabies are actually in a pretty good shot to give it a good crack, and it's not just because of the draw. You know, we've already seen the Wallabies manage to beat the Springboks, beat the English this year, beat Argentina away from home, missing half a dozen of first-choice players. We've seen them push the All Blacks right into the end at Melbourne. So the side has the potential to be playing well, but at the moment, consistency is its biggest Achilles heel, greatest Achilles heel. And until they resurrect that, they'll have no chance to the World Cup.
And Dave mentioned that on Saturday night, didn't he? He said that when you look at it from a World Cup perspective, you know, particularly when you get to the knockout phase, that if you don't have the ability to string consecutive wins together, you're not going to go very far. And right now at the moment, if Australia and Argentina were to play in a quarterfinal, that's an even money game. Argentina behind England. That's if we're expecting Pool C to go the way it is, or Pool D. I can't remember whether the Wallabies and Wales are, and Fiji for that matter, Pool C or D, and Argentina, England, and around the other way. There you go. Going back to
Stuart Barnes made a really great point in a column for the Times on the weekend, where he said, perhaps for the first time, it won't be the best 15 that wins you a World Cup. And arguably, you could say that the Springboks as 23 did in 2019. But he made the point that for the first time ever, a real squad is going to have to win you a World Cup. With the amount of concussions that are coming through, with the fact that it rules you out for so long, you need 2 squads. You need 3 10s that can really lead you around the park. Because for now, like, you look at this Wallaby side, you look at even what's happened with the All Blacks a week ago, where they lose Sam Cane, Dalton Papali'i to concussions. We saw that against the Springboks with Australia and Sydney, where Noah Olesio and Hunter Paisami get ruled out. In past World Cups, and maybe not so much in the recent 1 or 2, but particularly in World Cups gone by, a lot of players probably shouldn't have been playing that were playing. So having strengthened squads is so important, and that's where France really stands out. I think Ireland, to a lesser extent, given that they've got such a huge importance and their whole team and attack is focused by one person being Johnny Sexton. That is still the big question for Ireland going forward, is what happens if a Johnny Sexton's not there, because the rest of the squad is a strong one.
Yeah, Ireland, South Africa are clearly going to be one of the games of the pool phase. Now, I think it's about 348 days as of recording today to the World Cup. So can't wait for that all to kick off. Back to the Wallabies, we mentioned the Australia A Tour of Japan, three games in back-to-back weeks, Saturday, Friday, I think it is, between Tokyo, Osaka, and somewhere else. It's an interesting mix of players in that squad. I think it's about 8 or 9 Wallabies guys who've seen time this year. both you and I had a chuckle around the Darcy Swain stuff last week. Bit of creative accounting, perhaps, for want of a better expression there, to get him into that squad and then have him serve his ban, so he won't actually be playing. There's a lot to be gained from that tour, and certainly a number of players there who have been short on rugby. You think of your Lockie Lonigans and even Nick Frost, who's had a couple of games off the bench, and I think that one start against England, and he's a player I want to see more of. It's there are going to be three, I mean, Japan, it's a Japan 15, so I'm not sure exactly the strength, whether it will be, perhaps their absolute pick of their Brave Blossoms players, perhaps not, but valuable exposure. And Tom Banks, as you mentioned, a really interesting name, but well explained by Dave Rennie on Saturday night, saying that effectively he's still under contract with Rugby Australia through to December 31 this year. So that's why he's been picked on this tour. And I guess by the sounds of that is a genuine chance to go on to Europe thereafter. How do you see both I guess let's start with Australia, mate. What are you hoping, or what do you think that not only those players, but the Wallabies as a whole can get out of that tour?
I think more than anything, it's the Australia A program is hugely important for the Super Rugby franchises, because it allows them, without the NRC in operation, it allows 30 odd players to come together, and a number of them are playing together. But more than anything, they should be able to upskill over the next couple of months by playing more and more rugby. So I think from just a very simplistic perspective, it's great for the Super Rugby franchise, it's great for Australian rugby. When you look from a high performance perspective and you go from a Wallabies perspective, who has the potential of coming into consideration for Test rugby? Yeah, Tom Banks is probably the real standout person there, as well as Nick Frost. They're the two that you go, they can play at a World Cup. I haven't. It's going to be hugely fascinating to see what Dave Rennie does about his 3 picks next year from a kiddo law, overseas eligibility law perspective, because if you can only have 3 at this moment, if they're fit, you're picking Karevi Cooper and Marika Koroibete and potentially a Bernard Foley at 4. And that doesn't even bring in a Rory Arnold into the equation. I find it hard to believe that they're going to just stop short at 3. You think about even guys like Brandon Paenga-Amosa, who's really well suited, who's won a top 14 title with Montpellier, someone who's pretty good on the ball as well. I reckon you could see 5 or 6 guys that come right into the equation there, and they may be stretched out to 5. But Banks is a curious one, because if you're not playing him at next year's World Cup, then Jock Campbell should be wearing the 15 jersey and he should be playing it for 3 matches. And he should, by all reports, is coming into the consideration from a Wallabies perspective. But if you've got Tom Banks in that squad, he's not going to be playing 15 for 3 matches. And that's the long and the short of it. Guys like Ben Donaldson, Tane Edmund, big opportunities for them as well. And I think it's great to see Max Johansson, Jorgensen, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his last name. Jorgensen, as well as the Teddy Wilson in there. I think it's good to have these younger guys who have clearly got huge potential, because let's not forget, James O'Connor made his debut at Super Rugby at 17, 18 as a Wallabies player. Quade Cooper's similar sort of ages, Kurtley Beale's similar ages. Guys with huge potential can actually play. It's about harnessing and it's about making sure that their foundations are set. So to have him on a tour like this, I think is great.
People keep asking, it's when every squad's announced, or certainly through the Rugby Championship just gone, when is Suliasi Vunivalu going to get a game? Well, they're clearly paying big money, signed him again for next year earlier in the year to keep him around for the World Cup. Yet, aside from, I think it was about 90 seconds in the 3rd test, was it? He touched the ball maybe once in Sydney against England.
But he had 2 great touches, one getting the ball in the air, which would have allowed them to have another scrum, had time to set, but it went up to 80 minutes. And then obviously just nearly getting on the outside of Owen Farrell from a sweeping play inside their own 22.
So this is clearly a big opportunity for him as well. You would think that he'll get, you would hope, certainly 2 cracks on the right wing. And then that, if he plays to the level we think he can. And certainly it's been a very softly approach from Dave Rennie and the rest of the Wallabies selectors around kind of this idea of repeat efforts and repeat speed efforts and everything that you want to see from your winger. But on the back of Tom Wright's, I guess, indifferent display on the weekend, and I think we know what player Tom Wright is. We know what Australia are going to get from him. But it's a bit of the case of the Will Skelton factor from last year's spring tour, which you and I were completely confused about, is that without giving these players a start, you're never going to learn anything about them. So for Japan, this trip for Sully, you would think is going to be critical, a real chance to show his wares and then potentially, get a chance against a team like Scotland, who, I think he would perform really well against. Otherwise, the name I just mentioned, Will Skelton, is he in the frame to come in again? This massive uncertainty around this locking contingent that Australia has. Isaac Rodda hasn't been cited all year with that foot injury. There's another name, but Skelton, apart from a couple of 15-minute appearances off the bench last year, again, I don't think the Wallabies really learns whether this guy who has been nominated for the European Player of the Year a few times since he's been overseas, was part of La Rochelle's winning team, clearly. Whether he's got the game to play at test level or that purely is a top 14 in a European style of rugby, we just don't know whether, Will Skelton is legitimately a test option.
It's a great question, Sam. And what drives me crazy is that, and perhaps it's the naivety of a journalist, but it drives me crazy thinking that a bloke who wins a top 14, who's been not just won a European Championship Cup with La Rochelle, but also done it with Saracen, isn't considered to be good enough to go straight into a test program. I can't understand it. They will tell us that conditioning wise, they're off the pace for test standard. I think, well, you guys are bonkers, in my opinion, that you don't consider this guy. Yes, he might not have the repeat efforts or be able to get up the deck, all the various tests that they do at training to determine how good this person is and how great a shape they're in. But every now and again, sports science has got to be thrown out, because we see players who, I spoke to a couple of Wallabies last week who said Todd Kefu and George Smith, the two worst trainers that they've ever seen.
George Smith, legendary, horrific trainer, George Smith.
And similarly, Todd Kefu, but probably because George Smith is George Smith, always hogs those headlines. But you're not telling me that you're not picking a guy because he doesn't train well enough. And that's a Sully Vunivalu. That's the case with Sully Vunivalu. From my understanding, he took a massive haircut, half the pay to re-sign for this 2023 year. So he's gone from probably 7 to 750 down to close to 400, a tick under. That's a huge haircut. So it's not just a case of a bloke who's wanting to play, go back to the NRL afterwards. Like, he wants to play rugby, he wants to be at a World Cup, and fair play to him. But this guy could do anything, I think, on the right wing. We've seen it in limited touches. We've seen the extreme pace, the express pace. We've seen him bump away plays from the Blues and score tries at Eden Park. We've seen him score tries in quarterfinals of Super Rugby matches and do things that no one else could do on the Super Rugby field there. Yet, sorry, you're not good enough to play international rugby. It is my biggest gripe at the moment around that attitude. We've seen Rory Arnold get more than a handful of opportunities, and Rory Arnold's a grafter. He's not the sort of guy that's going to absolutely tear up a field, make a huge run through the middle. He's the sort of guy that loves the in-tight stuff, particularly around a rolling maul, generally really good at a set piece. But Will Skelton can do something that few other players can in world rugby. I can't understand why there's this huge hesitation and reluctance to throw him out there to sink or swing, because you know what? By seeing guys like, and this is the really harsh, brutal truth to it, seeing guys like Matt Phillip go round every week, we know what Matt Phillip can provide. And he won't let you down. He'll do everything he can. But can he turn a game? Maybe at a line out he can, but around the park he can't. But Will Skelton could. I think you've got enough depth and height in the back row to accommodate him. And if La Rochelle and if Saracens can get him into the nick that they have, to get him to become a world-class player, look at yourselves, guys, and pick him.
If Michael Hooper comes back, and we're not sure. Dave Rennie said he will tell us just exactly what the plan is with Hoops in the next couple of weeks. But by all reports, he's feeling a lot better about things, which is great. Number one. But given what we've seen from Samu and perhaps that bigger back row that did look quite threatening in Melbourne before Rob Leota went off, is there a position now that, or is there a thought now that Michael Hooper's position in the starting side, if he is to come back, is that under threat?
It could be, and it's been a long-held question. It may well be. Look, if he comes back, I don't expect him to be captain. Again, He might be a co-captain, but I know that there's been a huge reluctance and hesitance for that to be entertained in the past. But he'll be an on-field lead regardless. So, captaincy aside, is he good enough to be in that 15? Yes. Is he good enough to be in the 23? Certainly. I can't see a huge issue if he comes off the bench to begin with, and that's in fact where I would have him to come off. But Pete Samu deserves more opportunities, and whether or not that's at 6 or 7, I think 7. If you're going to play him in a team there with Rob Valentini there and Harry Wilson, I think he complements you really well. Could you have him and Michael Hooper? I'm not sure. I'm not certain. I don't think it's quite big enough. It's a good question, but I think that Michael Hooper probably is world class, has proved it for long enough. But I think I would have him come off the bench before bringing him into a starting side.
Seems like
maybe that answers itself in the time to come to see where exactly Michael Hooper is.
And he's clearly going to be underdone. He won't have the match fitness, so perhaps that is the best scenario that either in these opening tests against Scotland and then France, that's the best situation if he does come back, and which we think he probably will. All right, mate. To finish off, a question without notice. A player of the Rugby Championship from across the board. I find probably pretty tough to split the two hookers, Malcolm Marx and Samisoni Taukei'aho. For me, I think had both phenomenal tournaments, and it's amazing to think how often Malcolm Marx comes off the bench for the Springboks. And also would give a shout out to the young number 6 from Argentina, who I thought has been a real find for Michael Cheika.
Yeah, this is a question without notice, and I'm trying to rack my brain to go where, who. Look, there's something about Sam Whitelock that just makes me think this guy is Mr. Rugby. He is the sort of bloke that never lets you down. I loved what he did over the last 2 tests, but even against South Africa, he was the sort of bloke that lifted. I'm going to go Sam Whitelock. I think it's rare that you see a second role where you just go, this guy is just doing it and doing the business. I think he's been brilliant. The 2 hookers are great shouts. I think Boffelli from Argentina was very, very
excellent,
good as well.
Excellent tournament, yep.
So if I was to put those 3, a player from each, I'd go Malcolm Marx, Sam Whitelock, Boffelli, and Pete Samu. I think.
Yeah, Juan Martin Gonzalez, the name that I was looking there for an Argentina side that probably performed above expectations. Of course, that historic win in New Zealand and beating the Wallabies at home, and in both those games against South Africa, they were right in it with 15 minutes to play, but hurt by some later indiscipline. And I think what was it, 4 yellow cards on Saturday night in Durban, which is Wallabies areas. But anyway, all right, mate. Thank you for another week. It's been a really, really strong and fascinating time for the Rugby Championship, engaging on all fronts. Plenty to talk about week after week. There's certainly some concerns around the state of rugby in general, I think, across the world right now. The spectacle, and Dave Rennie mentioned that on Saturday night about the product that's being dished up, but it's certainly good for you and I because it gives us plenty to talk about.
Yeah, I think actually probably the best rugby championship in its history. I think I didn't mind the concept of a tour, and I still think though for World Rugby would love to see, and I would love to see a more of a shift to a 5 or 6 nations with the inclusion of Fiji and Japan. I think it would have added a lot to it, a lot of variety to it. It would bring different cultures into the play. And nor do I think the high performance would be necessarily a massive drop off. So lots to consider over the coming months.
Absolutely. And we'll be probably have a little break for the next few weeks. But when we see a spring tour squad or something, perhaps a big talking point around like a Michael Hooper return, we'll be back online. So thanks everyone for listening. And we'll talk to you again soon.